The Nissan Skyline R34 GT-R couldn't be stopped. While Nissan nearly went bankrupt building it and the Japanese government capped its power on paper, it didn't matter. The United States banned it from its roads. Production ended after just 11,578 units, and still the car kept winning races, kept climbing in value, and kept being worshipped decades after the last one rolled off the line. So how did a car built by a dying company become unstoppable? The answer starts in a glove box. Not the R34's glove box, but the one inside a beat-up, stock-looking Skyline from 10 years earlier, owned by a Nissan engineer named Hiroshi Tamura. He'd crammed 8 gauges inside it because there was nowhere else to put them. Boost pressure, oil temperature, differential temperature, exhaust temperature. Now look at the R34's dashboard, where a glowing multifunction display feeds the driver that same data in real time. Built right into the center console of a production car. Every feature in that display started in that glove box. But to understand how a personal project inside a beat-up car became the blueprint for one of the most desired machines ever built, you have to go back further. Because GT-R wasn't a trim level nor a marketing badge. It was a promise that Nissan had been making since 1969. When the first Skyline GT-R dominated Japanese touring car racing so completely that it redefined what a Japanese performance car could be. But then, in 1973, the GT-R vanished. For 16 years, the name sat dormant while an entire generation of enthusiasts grew up hearing stories about a car they'd never actually seen race. So, when Nissan's president Yutaka Kume launched an internal initiative called Project 901 in the mid-1980s with a mission to make Nissan the most technologically advanced automaker in the world by the 90s, the GT-R became the centerpiece of that ambition. The car that returned was the R32. And it didn't just meet the expectations that 16 years of silence had created, it shattered them. 29 consecutive wins in the Japanese Touring Car Championship across 4 full seasons without a single loss. Victories at Bathurst in Australia, at Spa in Belgium, and across the Australian Touring Car Series. The Australians started calling it Godzilla because nothing in their domestic racing could compete with it. And that nickname stuck to every GT-R that followed. The R32 set a standard that any successor would have to match, and that standard was total dominance. Then the ground fell out from under Nissan. Japan's economic bubble burst in the early 1990s, dragging the country into what economists now call the lost decade. Nissan had bet heavily on expansion during the boom years, and when the crash came, the company was left drowning in debt. By the late 1990s, only 3 of Nissan's 46 domestic models were actually turning a profit. 3 out of 46. The development budgets that had made Project 901 possible were slashed, and engineers who'd spent years being told to build the best cars in the world were suddenly being told to cut costs on everything they touched. The GT-R program felt that squeeze harder than most. Nissan's engineers had proposed a radical vision for the next generation. A mid-engine layout with an aluminum 6-cylinder engine, essentially a Japanese supercar wearing a GT-R badge. However, the finances to build it simply didn't exist. The proposal died before it even reached a working prototype, killed not by a lack of talent, but by a lack of money. At the same time, a quiet agreement among Japanese automakers capped every manufacturer's advertised horsepower at 280 PS, roughly 276 horsepower. It didn't matter what an engine actually produced on a dyno. On paper, every Japanese sports car made the exact same power. This agreement was originally meant to prevent a dangerous horsepower war between manufacturers, but instead it created a culture of official dishonesty where the gap between what a car claimed and what it actually delivered became an open secret that the entire industry understood and nobody publicly discussed. By 1998, the situation facing the GT-R team was almost impossible. The next GT-R would have to use the same basic platform and the same engine architecture from the late 1980s, while looming behind everything was a rescue deal with French automaker Renault, an alliance that would save Nissan from collapse, but would also end the era of purely Japanese engineering independence. So whatever came next wasn't just another GT-R. It was almost certainly the last car to carry both the Skyline and GT-R names together, the final link to the original vision from 1969. The crisis wasn't abstract. It had a face, and that face belonged to Carlos Ghosn, the cost-cutting executive that French automaker Renault sent to save Nissan from itself. When Ghosn arrived and opened the books, what he found was staggering. Nearly every car Nissan sold was losing money. The company wasn't just struggling, it was bleeding out. And in that environment, greenlighting an expensive low-volume sports car that would sell maybe a few thousand units a year was almost impossible to justify. The GT-R program wasn't a priority. The engineering team had to work with the RB26DETT, a twin-turbocharged inline six-cylinder engine that had been designed in the late 1980s. And they had to build on the existing Skyline platform because starting from scratch was financially impossible. If Nissan ever built another GT-R after this one, it would drop the Skyline name entirely. Whatever they created now would be the last car to carry both badges together, Skyline and GT-R, the final connection to the original vision they had started decades earlier. They weren't just trying to build a car with no money. They were trying to write the last chapter of a legacy, and they had to make it worthy of everything that came before. The pressure was suffocating. Build a car that lives up to the most dominant name in Japanese racing history. But there was someone who'd been preparing for exactly this moment. Not in a Nissan office or a corporate development center, but in his own garage, on his own time, with his own money. Hiroshi Tamura didn't just stumble into the GT-R story, he'd been walking toward it his entire life. As a young man growing up in Japan, he watched the original first-generation GT-R racers tearing around Fuji Speedway, saw the legendary 30-degree banking, and something ignited in him that never went out. He didn't just want to work in the car industry. He wanted to work at Nissan specifically, and eventually on the GT-R. When he applied for a job, he later said that Nissan was the only door I ever knocked on. He joins the company in 1984, but the GT-R wasn't his to touch yet, so for years he worked on other projects. Then in 1989, the R32 GT-R went on sale, and Tamura did something that would quietly set the entire R34 story in motion. He bought one, not with a comfortable savings account or an executive bonus, but by stretching himself to the breaking point. In his own words, "I superstretched myself financially, got a giant loan from a bank, but the desire is so strong, I want to buy it." He took it to the Fuji Speedway. He drove it on the winding mountain roads for what he called street entertainment. And over the next decade, he modified it obsessively, not for car meets or bragging rights, but because he wanted to understand that machine at a level that no amount of desk engineering could ever provide. He built it up to roughly 600 horsepower, about what the infamous Group A Godzilla racing cars had produced, while keeping the exterior completely stock, a sleeper in every sense. A car that looked like a daily commuter, but hit like a freight train. Every modification had a purpose. He added a flat underbody to improve the aerodynamics at speed. He developed an active rear differential to sharpen the way the car rotated through corners. And because he needed constant data on what the car was doing but had nowhere to display it, he crammed those 8 gauges into the glove box. And on the front bumper of this Nissan engineer's personal car sat a faded Midnight Club decal, a quiet tribute to Japan's most infamous illegal street racing group, the same organization whose disbandment would later force Tamura to rename his signature color. He'd originally called it Wangan Blue, after the Bayshore Expressway where those midnight racers drove. But when the connection became too controversial, management made him change it. His solution was quietly brilliant. Bayside is almost a direct translation of Wangan. The meaning stayed hidden in plain sight. When the R34's program desperately needed answers and there was no budget for innovation from scratch, Tamura's decade of personal obsession became the research department. The flat underbody from his R32 became the R34's undertray. The active rear differential became standard equipment on the higher spec V-Spec model, and those 8 gauges he'd crammed into the glove box became the R34's famous multifunction display, the first system of its kind in any production car. This wasn't just any R32. This was the car from which the all-conquering 1999 R34 took its influence. He wasn't alone in the fight. The chief vehicle engineer, a man named Kozo Watanabe, brought his own stubborn perfectionism to every detail. When his boss told him a plywood rear diffuser would be good enough, Watanabe insisted on carbon fiber. And Kazutoshi Mizuno, who took over the project and would later create the next generation R35 GT-R, pushed the engineering standards even further. The vision was there. Now the question was no longer about who would build this car. It was about what they actually built and what made it different from everything else on the road. To understand what made the R34 special, you have to start with a lie. That gentleman's agreement capped the R34's advertised power at 280 PS, making it officially no more powerful than a Mitsubishi Evo or a Toyota Supra. On a dyno, the truth was something else entirely. The R34 produced closer to 330 horsepower, nearly 20% more than Nissan was allowed to admit. The engine itself, the RB26DETT, had been designed in the late 1980s by an engineer named Naganori Ito, who'd originally planned it as a 2.4-liter. But racing regulations rewarded larger displacement, so Ito pushed for 2.6 liters against serious internal resistance. The engine design chief later said that he'd been tricked into approving the increase. When the first prototype ran, it idled at 2,000 RPM and made loud blow-off sounds with every throttle lift. The engineers present said it didn't seem like a product. But through years of development, that rough prototype became one of the most over-engineered power plants ever fitted to a road car. An engine so massively built beyond its official output that tuners would eventually push it to 3 times its stock power without touching the bottom end. But raw power was only one piece of the puzzle. What made the R34 feel superhuman was a system called the ATT-ESA E-TS Pro, and the easiest way to understand it is to forget everything you know about all-wheel drive. In normal driving, 100% of the power went to the rear wheels. The system read the road 1,000 times per second, and the instant it detected slip, it redirected torque to the front axle in milliseconds. Combined with the active rear differential that Tamura had perfected on his personal R32, the result was a car that didn't just grip, it adjusted, it flattered. One reviewer drove it through the mountains of Japan and wrote that the car flatters your modest abilities and makes you feel you might actually be a driving god. Then there was the chassis, the part almost nobody talks about. 56% stiffer than the previous R33. Aluminum suspension arms, saving 2.6 kilograms of unsprung weight per corner. A front under tray that eliminated aerodynamic lift entirely. Brake cooling improved by 50 degrees Celsius. The R34 wasn't a car built around one breakthrough. It was a systems car where every element worked together as one integrated weapon. In 1999, no production car on Earth gave its driver this much information. It treated the driver as a partner, not a passenger, and that feeling is what separated the R34 from everything else on the road. In 1998, before the R34s had been shown to the public, Tamura decided to take it to a special place, the Nürburgring, the most demanding racetrack on Earth. Over 20 kilometers of blind crests and elevation changes, carved through forests of Western Germany. Tamura had been there over 100 times during his career, spending more than 500 days at that circuit. And this is where he chose to reveal the R34 for the very first time. Shortly after, test driver Kazu Jimsu lapped the Nürburgring in 7 minutes and 52 seconds. Unofficial? Yeah, but the fastest production car lap at the time. The Nürburgring was only the beginning, because what happened next wasn't a single victory. It was an avalanche. Former Formula One driver Eric Comas won the Japanese Grand Touring Car Championship in the R34 in 2001. Then he won it again in 2002. Back-to-back titles with 0 mechanical retirements across both seasons. Comas called the R34 the ideal car for winning a championship because of its manageable torque and extraordinary reliability. Then came the ultimate statement. Nissan's racing division Nismo took 19 used R34 V-specs with less than 30,000 kilometers on the clock, stripped every one to a bare shell, and rebuilt them into the Z-Tune. the strongest road-going car in the world. The engine block came from Nissan's GT500 racing program. Every piston was weight-matched to within a single gram. Each engine received its own serial number for lifetime tracking. Despite all that power, Nismo engineered the clutch to feel light and easy, deliberately emphasizing that this vehicle is a road-going car and not a racing car. 19 built. Price, 16.9 million yen. And while all this was happening on track, the R34 was exploding across every screen on the planet. In 2003, Too Fast, Too Furious put a Bayside Blue R34 in front of millions of moviegoers. All 5 GT-Rs in the film were real cars, air-freighted from Japan on a Boeing 747 at roughly $48,000 each. At the same time, the R34 was taking over Gran Turismo, Need for Speed, Midnight Club, Initial D, and Wangan Midnight. Car Magazine captured the cultural moment in a single sentence, calling the R34 the PlayStation generation's Lamborghini Countach. By the time production ended in August 2002, the R34 had become something that transcended any single achievement. Nothing could stop it. Nothing even came close. But the car's influence didn't end when the assembly line went quiet. If anything, that's when the most surprising part of the story began. The gentleman's agreement was supposed to limit the R34. Instead, it created an entire culture. Because when Nissan built the RB26 DETT so far beyond its official rating, they didn't just leave room for the factory to hide extra power. They left room for everyone else to find it. The engine was so over-engineered that tuners pushed it to 3 times its stock output without opening the bottom end. Kazuko Nagata, the legendary builder known as Smokey, constructed a top-secret R34, making 641 horsepower at the wheels, and drove it as a daily car. The lie that was supposed to cap the R34's power ended up creating an entire industry dedicated to unlocking it. The gentleman's agreement didn't suppress the car. It gave it a second life. But the R34's strangest superpower was the one nobody planned for: the fact that you couldn't have one. The car was never officially sold in the US. A company called Motorex managed to federalize just 14 before being shut down by regulators. So for an entire generation of American enthusiasts who would grow up racing it in video games and watching it on movie screens, the R34 became the car on the other side of the glass, the one you couldn't touch. And that made them want it even more. American import law requires a car to be at least 25 years old before it can be legally brought in, which meant the first 1999 R34s didn't become eligible until 2024. By then, rough examples were selling for $50,000. Z-Tunes approached $800,000. Evo wrote that unmodified R34s had become as rare as unclaimed lottery tickets. The car had become so desired that people were willing to commit crimes to own one. In 2022, Formula One champion Lewis Hamilton rented an R34 during the Japanese Grand Prix weekend. The car was later stolen, found stripped in a shipping container in Yokohama, being prepared for a legal export. And through all of it, Tamura kept working. After the R34, he became the driving force behind the next generation R35 GT-R, championing a V6 and a dual-clutch transmission when the idea of a GT-R without a manual gearbox and an inline 6 seemed like heresy. He recalled that some people thought I was crazy, pushing for only 2 pedals. The man whose personal R32 had created the blueprint for the R34 went on to shape its successor as well. Now, with the R35 production ending in 2025, people keep asking whether the GT-R name will survive. Tamura's answer is always the same. I tell people to be patient. Think back to that glove box. 8 gauges crammed into a space meant for parking receipts, installed by a man who couldn't afford the car they were bolted into, but couldn't live without it either. That's where the R34 GT-R actually began. Not even in a corporate development program, but in the personal car of an engineer who bought his dream on borrowed money and then spent a decade making it better because he simply couldn't help himself. The R34 couldn't be stopped because it was never really a corporate product. When Nissan was dying and there was no money for a clean sheet design, Tamura's obsession filled that gap. A decade of modifications, a decade of data, a decade of driving poured into a production car during the last possible window before the money ran out completely. That obsession made the car too precise to beat on track, too capable to leave alone in a tuner's garage, and too beautiful to forget on a screen. You can end production, you can ban imports, you can even cap the power on paper, but you cannot stop a car that was built on love rather than budget. We thank you so much for watching this video. If you did enjoy yourself, please make sure to subscribe and check out one of the other videos here on the channel.